Hello, everyone, and welcome to Passion Fruits, a passion project for passionate people. I'm your acai guy, Adam.
Oh, and yeah. I'm your nanner pudding, Daniel.
Nanner pudding, huh?
Yep.
I don't think nanner pudding is a fruit, Daniel.
Well,
you really stretch.
I don't think acai guy is technically a fruit either, Adam.
Acai is... Acai is a berry.
I know acai is a what? I know what it is, but acai guy is not a fruit. So
I mean, all right, fine. Then I'm your acai Adam. Anyways, Daniel,
damn it.
don't get us off track.
Don't get it twisted.
Welcome to Passion Fruits, a passion project for passionate people. This is a podcast. If you all haven't heard of a podcast before, Daniel, why don't you tell our listeners, our billions of listeners, what a podcast is?
Well, a podcast is like radio for the internet. And on this podcast, we delve into subjects that we are passionate about, subjects that our guests are passionate about, try and get down to the nugget, the diamond, the stone, if you will, of why somebody becomes so obsessed with a certain subject or thing or place or noun or whatever. But yeah, so today, what are we talking about today, Adam?
Today, we are talking about one of Daniel and I's favorite comic strips, Calvin and Hobbes. Not to be confused with the notable philosophers Calvin and Hobbes.
John Calvin and John Hobbes, I think.
Is it?
Right? I don't know. Hold on, let me look at the outline. I'd say.
Yep, John Calvin, and then
Jimbo Hobbes.
Thomas Hobbes. I knew it was
Thomas Hobbes. Yeah, Jimbo Hobbes.
Yeah.
Tommy Hobbes.
Good old Jimmy H, as they call him.
That's my favorite clothing line. Tommy Hobbes.
Oh, really?
Yes, Tommy Baham.
What's
Hobbes? No, it's too early in the morning for this.
They're
by too early, I mean 10:30 in the morning.
They're Hawaiian button-up shirts with little red, white, and blue flags on them, huh?
Exactly.
Nice.
Yes.
See, we're just all at the mashups here. We're very avant-garde.
Yeah,
we're like the EDM of podcasting.
We're the girl talk of podcasting. So let's do some D&D right now. All right, Adam, roll a D20.
Oh, I got a 52. I rolled 3 D20s, actually.
Once you rolled a 20 and you have a plus 32 to charisma.
It's true. Yeah.
Always knew you were a very charismatic young man.
Muy charismatico, senor.
In multiple languages. You're bi-coastal. Shit. Let's hop into it, Adam, before we just go on off entirely different tangent. So we're talking about my favorite comic strip, Adam's favorite comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes today. Adam, what is a comic strip?
A comic strip was they are panels of comics are like fairly simple artistry that used to be displayed in things called newspapers. Now, we may need to explain what a newspaper is to our readers and listeners, but primarily readers.
Our newspaper readers. Newspapers is where you usually got the news, but there was where I grew up, we got the Washington Post, and in the style section was where you could find the comic strips.
In the style section, really?
Yeah. Where did you read your comic strips?
I guess we got the Post, and then we had the Daily News Record, which is it's like the New Jersey of newspapers. It's the armpit of newspapers. It stinks. That's what I'm trying to say.
It stinks. It stinks. It stinks.
I think ours were in the opinion section.
Well, I mean, who's more opinionated than a comic strip artist?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But yeah, like Adam said, similar to comic books, comic strips were sequential stories in square format or rectangular format that were usually 3 to 4 panels on the weekdays, and then on Sundays is when comic authors and artists could expand a little bit, and strips were 9, sometimes, as we'll get into it with Bill Watterson, could take up a whole page of color comics. And there are several long-running comic strips like Peanuts, which may just be classic Peanuts, even though they're still running. There's, of course, Garfield, my second favorite comic strip.
Is it really your second favorite comic strip?
We'll get into comic strips and which ones I was into, but I mean, unfortunately, maybe it's so bad. But yeah, they are kind of comic strips have kind of run the gamut of subjects, but the one we're going to talk specifically about centers around a young 6-year-old boy, Calvin, and his stuffed animal tiger, Hobbes. As our outline says, his sardonic stuffed tiger. However, in Calvin and Hobbes, while all grown-ups and other individuals see Hobbes, the tiger, as a stuffed animal, Calvin sees him as a living and breathing tiger.
Rare
Indeed, Adam. Let's get some late morning delight going in. But yeah, so Adam, do you want to introduce Calvin and Hobbes a little bit more?
Yeah, so Calvin and Hobbes was really introduced back, let's see, in like the mid 80s, essentially. So our Passion Fruits PD section states that the first strip was published on November 18th, 1985, wow. In just 35 newspapers. Now, as the comic strip was made more popular, at the height of its popularity, it featured in over 2,400 newspapers worldwide, and actually reruns are still printed in newspapers to this day. I think, and we're going to talk about this as well, but a big part of the comic strip is I wouldn't say cult of personality, but kind of the mystery behind Bill Watterson, who is the author and comic strip driver. Basically, he is Calvin and Hobbes, and his at times contentious relationship with newspapers and with the newspaper industry, with the comics, with kind of the business side of drawing and writing comic strips, and then especially with the idea of syndication and how he's supposed to make his money as an artist. Yeah. But Calvin and Hobbes, I mean, Calvin's a 6-year-old boy, a very, very well-spoken 6-year-old boy, which I think is one of the endearing parts about the strip. And basically, it's him living his life. He trying to make it in this workaday world. Exactly. He's just working 9 to 5, like Dolly Parton. No, I think and we're going to really dive into this when it gets to the I Heart Calvin and Hobbes section, but they're broader themes about what the strips are about, and it's everything from the mundane, like taking baths and having to clean up his room, to broader issues of public health and education and environmentalism. There's a lot of philosophical discussion going on within the comic strip, and then the third aspect to this that I think is one of the most fantastic is the wild kind of expressive imagination that Calvin has. And once again, that ties back to Calvin just as this really dynamic character. So, I think where some comic strips are pretty myopic in focus and the jokes are kind of rehashed over and over again, Calvin and Hobbes really in my opinion, push the boundaries of what having a comic strip was capable of doing. So anyways, that's that. We've kind of blurred the lines there a little bit, but yeah. What other aspects of Calvin and Hobbes do you want to point out, like the characters or the format, so on and so forth?
I guess as we're kind of getting into our Cocoa Corner and other sections of our episode, I guess one thing that really typified the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip was how much Bill Watterson pushed the art form, and like he considered comic strips an art form, and how he continued to push that forward to try and express as much as he could in, 3 panels or on a Sunday strip. I mean, by the middle 3/4 of his career, he was getting full pages in the Sunday strips. He was not using panels. It would just be huge splash pages of a T-Rex flying a F-14 fighter jet. Bill Watterson really took while other people kind of looked down on comic strips and comic strip artists, Bill Watterson really pushed what you could do as an artist. And people consider, once Calvin and Hobbes was done, people consider that was like the last golden age of comic strip comics. And I certainly haven't kept up with comic strips, mostly because I don't get a newspaper anymore. But
you what?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I mean, I go down to my local 5 and Dime every single morning, pick up the news, and say, Eisenhower did what? Get me on the ticker tape. But
I just get my news via telegraph every morning. That's what happens.
Oh, nice. I get mine via carrier pigeon, which in this time probably is not good because I think they're dirty, dirty birds. But just like me, I'm a dirty bird. So yeah, why don't we? Is there anything else you want to talk about with Calvin and Hobbes, Adam?
I think it gives. The further descriptions of the comic strip will be revealed as we go into Coca Corner and the I Heart Calvin and Hobbes section. So, Daniel, do you want to start us off and talk about how you got into Calvin and Hobbes and how that's evolved over time?
Yeah. So, like I kind of talked about in our comic book episode, I got into comic strips and comics in general, kind of in middle school when we would come home from school. And that was around the time that me and my brothers could go home, and both our parents were working, so we would be home alone. So we were old enough to be home alone, and I would usually have a snack after coming home from school, taking the bus home, and then reading the comic strips when I was eating my snack and reading the style section of the Washington Post, getting all the movie reviews, like figuring out what's going on in the fashion world. And that's just how I got so fashionable today. I'm on the cutting edge of everything right now.
Oh yeah, it's very, very cutting edge. That's
Yes.
why people listen to us, Daniels. They want to know what's up.
Edge.
You're the trend setter, or at least the trend identifier for the trends that you're not immediately involved in.
Yeah, I'm the trend jet setter because I like to fly around a bunch.
Hopefully not now. Hashtag COVID-19.
It's really difficult. But yeah, when I would read the comic strips, the kind of classic ones that you would think would be in there were there. Garfield, Dilbert, Peanuts, Boondocks were there. Trying to remember some of the other ones. But unfortunately, Calvin and Hobbes wasn't, which is kind of strange that Calvin and Hobbes wasn't being reprinted in the Washington Post. And I think I might have gotten a Calvin and Hobbes, like the essential Calvin and Hobbes, a compendium of some of the comics as like a birthday gift one time.
Yeah.
Or when Borders was still a thing, we went to a Borders and I would immediately head to the humor section. And before I was picking up Garfield's Fat Cat 3-packs.
Wait, Daniel. I thought we're it's sad that Borders doesn't exist, but at least we're recording inside an abandoned Borders right now.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how we've maintained our distance. Is Adam's at one end of the Borders. He's in the DVD section, and I'm in the humor section. That's why all my jokes are so funny. But yeah, so I would go immediately to the humor section, look at Garfield Fat Cat 3-packs, and look at Calvin and Hobbes books, and try and convince my parents to let me buy another book of comic strips. And what was nice was that my parents, I remember reading in middle school and high school, and my love for comic strips continued through high school. And I know I read actual books in middle school and high school, but I'm trying to remember really what books I read. I know I was reading books for English class and stuff like that, but it was almost like comic strips and reading Calvin and Hobbes were a good way for me to read and escape those kind of school assigned books that I could kind of my mind could take a little bit of a break. And my parents never discouraged me from reading, especially Calvin and Hobbes, because Calvin, for a 6-year-old, is very well read. So yeah, I was never discouraged from reading comic strips, and my love for Calvin and Hobbes just deepened so much just by trying to collect as many of the classic collections as I could, like Revenge of the Babysat, Attack of the Giant Killer Monster Snow Goons, Homicidal Psycho Jungle Cat. It was just this amazing kind of world that Bill Watterson created with amazing characters and amazing artwork and amazing jokes and humor that made me just laugh out loud at him. I lolled and ruffled all over the place. So I know that's just a snapshot of how I got into Calvin and Hobbes. How did you get into Calvin and Hobbes?
So I got into Calvin Hobbes. I was introduced to it from my aunt. Or aunt, whichever part of the country you prefer to pronounce that word. So my aunt introduced me to Calvin and Hobbes. The first collection that she gave us gave me was Homicidal Psycho Jungle Cat. So it's the black cover with Hobbes jumping out of the closet, jumping out of the door, getting ready to pounce on Calvin. And I remember the first time we got it, we basically spent half a day just reading through it, and it was usually like my aunt reading to us, and I was 5, maybe 6 at the time.
Gotcha.
And so really young, and quite frankly, I didn't understand a lot of the jokes.
I'm not surprised.
So there were a lot of different. I think this is the brilliance of the comic strip is. It's rereadable, and you get something new, and you get the nuance every time you read it. But I remember, the jokes I was drawn to initially were all like kind of the slapstick comedy jokes that, I would say make up the outermost layer of most common Calvin and Hobbes, strips. So but I really loved those. And basically, as I started to identify more with Calvin and Hobbes as kind of like my favorite comic strip. And that pushed me into, like yourself, getting more of the collections and the books. And especially as I got older, more closer to 10, 11 years old, I really enjoyed reading the collections that had Bill Watterson's commentary in there. So like reading the forwards or the afterwards, and like the 10th anniversary collection, which is like his best of up to that point, like had his notes and kind of his creative process. And like I said, we'll get into that a little bit later on. And then I wrapped it up a few years ago with the complete Calvin and Hobbes 4-book set. Before we started recording, Adam and I got into a huge argument about the hardcover complete Calvin and Hobbes versus the soft cover. I maintain the hardcover is the way to go. Adam says soft cover is. The hardcover, the binding starts to fall apart every single review I've heard. So apparently I'm just a bigger fan of Calvin and Hobbes because I want longevity in my collection.
I showed you my collection. I took a picture of it. I didn't open the book, so you couldn't see the bindings, but they are perfectly fine, Adam. I also know how to see, back in 4th grade for the Colonial Williamsburg fair we did, I was a bookbinder, so I learned how to bind books.
Oh, okay. So
just if your collection ever falls apart, I will put on my Colonial pantaloons and I will buy candlelight, sew and stitch your book back together.
Good to know. Maybe I'll just have you make my soft covers into hard covers. How about
exactly.
that?
Oh yeah. I'll draw Calvin and Hobbes myself.
Okay. This will be great.
I'll add new characters. One of them is going to be Ice Cube.
Oh no.
Do you think Ice Cube ever ended up having a good day? Sorry,
this just really delves into the deep philosophical questions around Southern California 80s and 90s hip hop. This is a dramatic change. Well
this
done.
Is our Like I said, this is our bi-coastal episode.
Yes. See.
Yeah, I do see, Adam. I do see.
Anyways, to the subject at hand. So I'd say Calvin and Hobbes really encouraged me to start reading more comics.
Yeah.
As in general. So I started reading a lot of other comics, such as I love Foxtrot. It's still going on. Shoe. Do you remember the comic strip Shoe? Is that
I think I read some of that. Yeah.
I have a couple of this collection. Yeah, I don't know what drew me to that comic strip, but I always enjoyed it.
Did you ever get into the Far Side? Because that was another. It was like Garfield, Calvin and Hobbes, and the Far Side that were my big 3 comic strips. I
really enjoyed Far Side. I have a couple Far Side collections as well.
Nice.
But yeah, Zits, Pearls Before Swine, and then I've recently just starting to reread Dilbert.
Which is so disappointing to me, Adam. I don't know why, but it is.
It speaks to me so much as a entrenched person who works in the tech industry.
Luckily, you don't hate women, so
that's true. I think the interesting thing is, I didn't really enjoy Peanuts or actually Garfield or some of the more classic comic strips. I just didn't find as funny, and maybe because they weren't as nuanced as like Calvin and Hobbes or Shoe.
Right.
I actually think Pearls Before Swine has a wonderfully sarcastic tone to it that I really like, and I think that starts to mirror some of the Calvin and Hobbes type humor.
Yeah.
I'd say Shoe was a big one for me that I identified a lot with as far as like the type of humor that Calvin and Hobbes, and kind of with that evolution, reading Calvin and Hobbes did, as it pushed me into other comic strips, it actually makes me come back and really appreciate Calvin and Hobbes every time I go back and reread the comic strips. I think it's this wonderfully unique medium and a wonderfully unique sense of humor and tone that I don't think anyone has matched since Bill Watterson.
Yeah.
So, I'd say the other thing too is it definitely opened me up to different other comic strips, but it made me read the newspaper because every my sister and I would argue over who gets the funnies section every Sunday. So that was like the big thing in our households when the Washington Post came and the big color comic strip section would come. That's where we would get into some squabbles over who gets to read what first.
Oh man. Did reading Calvin and Hobbes ever get you into, because I remember reading some Calvin and Hobbes strips, and Calvin has multiple alter egos, like his detective Tracer Bullet, of course his spaceman Spiff character, his superhero character Stupendous Man, along with many others. Did that ever either inspire you to draw, or did it inspire you to, and since you got into Calvin and Hobbes pretty young, did it ever inspire you to kind of imagine like you were Stupendous Man or Tracer Bullet or Spaceman Spiff? Did you ever play in that kind of space that Calvin played in?
I'd say it was concurrent. I think one of the beautiful things about Calvin and Hobbes is all the different imaginative worlds that he was sent to with Hobbes in like a cardboard box. So I don't think it didn't make me want to go and like be Spaceman Spiff, but it definitely pushed myself and my sister to go play outside and like think of different games. As far as, how do I put this? So, yes and no. It didn't inspire me to draw. Gotcha. I think I tried once to like do a comic strip and it was terrible.
You tried once to do a page exactly like Bill Watterson, and you're like, damn it, why can't I be as good as Bill Watterson?
Exactly. I didn't understand why. I remember being inspired to do like really interesting things. And granted, the house I grew up in, especially
was a very, very, very fine house with 2 cats in the yard. Life used to be so hard. Now everything is easy because of Calvin and Hobbes.
So one of the motifs about Calvin and Hobbes is he has this like expansive backyard, which looks like a state forest essentially.
Yeah.
But that was more or less my backyard. Like we had basically a big forested area in our backyard that sloped down to a river. So a lot of the stuff that Calvin did, like making forts and going exploring and all that stuff, like my sister and I did all the time because that was just like what we did. So that was always interesting. And I think so it wasn't as fantastical as I think a lot of other people perceived that setting to be, just because it was like, oh yeah, that's like what I do on the reg.
Right.
How about yourself, Daniel? Did you try and like become were you a burgeoning comic strip artist? And
well, now I'm trying to think in rethinking talking about Calvin and Hobbes and how you got into it. I'm trying to remember, because I remember a friend from elementary school and middle school and high school, Tom. He was a huge Calvin and Hobbes fan, and he might have actually introduced me to Calvin and Hobbes in elementary school when I was still kind of playing imaginative games with my younger brother. I do remember sitting up in our tree fort, pretending to be spies and using the acronym GROSS, get rid of slimy girls. And in kind of talking about Calvin's alter egos, because Calvin, one thing I love about the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip is, while there are some strips that are just self-contained, Bill Watterson often did complete series that would run for a week, 2 weeks, where Calvin would get into certain situations and would have to get out of that. But some of the series and one-shot comics that Bill Watterson did were focused on Spaceman Spiff and Stupendous Man. And I'm trying to think if that's like kind of what, because I love reading sci-fi, and of course I love the superhero movies that have all come out. I wonder if Calvin and Hobbes really like fostered that interest in science fiction and the superhero movies now kind of connect me back to that more innocent time of, the coolest superhero you could read about was Stupendous Man, who was actually a 6-year-old kid who had a stuffed tiger as his sidekick. Yeah. So, we're just discovering a lot about ourselves today, Adam. Life and stuff. I definitely tried to create my own comic strips, but really, I've always liked drawing and sketching, even just doodling. I've done that my entire life. But what really kind of resonated with me with Calvin and Hobbes was just the sense of humor. And that is something like how we talked about in our Simpsons episode, how when I started watching The Simpsons in like high school, that really shaped my sense of humor. Like Calvin and Hobbes going from elementary school to middle school and to high school to now has also really shaped my sense of humor, with just the wordplay that Bill Watterson used to craft a joke, to the fantastical worlds that he created.
So question for you too. Were other members of your family as invested in Calvin and Hobbes or comic strips in general?
No, not really. My younger brother, and my older brother kind of had a phase where he read some of the Garfield and Dilbert stuff. My younger brother would often read I think he read maybe most of the Calvin and Hobbes and most of the Garfields that we had, but I don't think he held on to it as much as I did. And I don't think he would, I don't think he would have like a Calvin and Hobbes collection. I considered the Calvin and Hobbes collections that we had to be mine. Maybe that's selfish as an older brother, but I was really the one who would read them and then reread them almost immediately in our house. So, yeah. What did your sister have a similar thing, or
she did to a certain extent. Like she has a couple Calvin and Hobbes books, but like my parents didn't really read comic strips. And I don't think it was just like an adult versus child thing.
Yeah.
Because obviously it was like my aunt who introduced me. One of my other aunts, the first thing she grabs out of the Sunday paper is the funny section.
right.
So I guess it's just not in my parents' personality, but I know I really enjoy the medium, if you will.
Yeah, totally.
So, but yeah, well, I think that good storytelling.
Yeah,
Mr. Dubin.
Good Cocoa Corner.
Nice. Let's hop into. I think this is going to be the most fun section of just why we heart Calvin and Hobbes and what we think separates it. That kind of sets it apart from a lot of other comic strips. Daniel, do you want to kick off? You want me to go?
Sure, I can kick off a little bit, and we can trade kind of stories, and
Okay.
because I think probably a lot of the reasons why we love Calvin and Hobbes is going to be similar. One thing, and I know I talked about it in our Cacao Corner. One thing that I love is the absurd stories that Bill Watterson came up with. It's interesting because he's an adult creating this comic strip. Then people consider comic strips for kids, but it's this 6-year-old kid and this stuffed tiger talking like adults, but he puts them in fantastic situations and fantastic stories that are just, the absurdity of it is just so wonderful.
I think it's absurd, but at the same time, it's very relatable.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And absurd. I think absurd in that it's a 6-year-old who's almost more mature sometimes than not more mature than the adults around him, but
sorry, do you mind if I cut in?
Yeah,
I think
go for it.
This is a point. I think Bill Watterson does an amazing job of giving the perspective of a situation as a 6-year-old. So
Yeah.
I think Calvin's vocabulary belays like this very perceptive personality that Calvin has, and it's this really, really like fantastic balance of being very thoughtful about things and Calvin thinking deeply about certain philosophical things, but from the perspective of a 6-year-old. And at the same time, most of that's still being driven by the underlying immaturity of being a 6-year-old.
right.
So I think it's this, I don't know if Bill Watterson's a child psychologist or anything, but I think it points to how well children's personalities are, or how well developed children's personalities are around this age. But many times their underlying immaturity or just their reaction to stimuli in general tend to kind of mask that, or they're not able to express that to adults. And I think that's where Hobbes comes in. Is Hobbes this yin to Calvin's yang, and even though he's a stuffed animal in real life, like it's Calvin having these really philosophical discussions with his stuffed animal / best friend,
right.
And because of that, I think one of the key things about Calvin and Hobbes is that whenever there's an adult in the room, or in the panel, Hobbes is a stuffed tiger, but whenever it's just Calvin and Hobbes, Hobbes is this fully anthropomorphic character.
Right.
So like I said, I think Bill Watterson just plays really, really well off of that, this kind of dual reality that Calvin that Calvin lives in, as being, this 6-year-old who like knows everything, is ready to take on the world, but at the same time, a child.
Right. And because I see one of your points in our outline was that you kind of identify more with Calvin's parents, and in talking about those series that I talked about in our Cocoa Corner, how Bill Watterson, rather than having one-shot comic strips, would do comic strips that had an overarching story. And there were such, classic series as Calvin cuts his own hair. At least once a year during the summer, Calvin's family would go camping. So there would be a whole week of comic strips based around Calvin going camping, and, the one week where it just rained the entire time.
Yeah.
But like you talked about how there's the fantastical side and the more relatable side, there were plenty of series and strips. There's a beautiful Sunday strip where Calvin and Hobbes find a dead bird, and they talk about the meaning of death. And then there's the series where Calvin and Hobbes find an injured raccoon, and they bring it back to Calvin's parents and try and save the raccoon. And some of it, some of it is kind of heavy for a 6-year-old, but it's, I don't have children, and like a 6-year-old, I believe maybe that's like the time when children really start to deal with that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's almost like a comic strip that you could read as a younger person, enjoy the artwork, the slapstick humor, then read it as an older person, enjoy the vocabulary and the language that Bill Watterson uses, and then enjoy it as an adult when you're maturing and having your own children and being like, oh crap, Calvin and Hobbes is more relatable than ever, because how am I going to talk to my children about death?
Right.
But I know you said in the outline, it says you relate more to Calvin's parents now than Calvin.
Well,
I think, identify with him more. Yeah,
I think that just, once again, I think it's this really just really, really talented balance of not vilifying anyone in the comic strip. Like, there's no discernible bad guy. And like, you can understand the perspective of every character, and
right.
Whether it be Rosalind the babysitter, or Calvin's parents, or the Mrs. Wormwood or Miss Wormwood the teacher, or Susie Durkins. We list all these secondary characters off here, but there's definitely this. You can sympathize and empathize with each one of their actions and their reactions to Calvin's antics. And that's why, like, especially with Calvin's parents, because we have so many friends that have kids now and that are going through some of this stuff. It's like, oh yeah, like kids can be really stupid. Or like, Sarah, as my girlfriend who's a teacher, some of the reactions that like Mrs. Wormwood has, she was never, I would say, as outwardly, Sarah's not outwardly abusive like Mrs. Wormwood, but you can tell like there's this underlying frustration of like dealing with this troublesome kid who is like intelligent and means well, but just like has no outlet for it within the classroom and just blatantly disturbs the rest of the classroom while he's like trying to be funny.
Right. Yeah, exactly. One thing in identifying more with the Calvin's parents, one thing I love about Calvin's dad is that he's a cyclist.
Yeah. And he's an attorney.
Right. And there's a great strip where he's riding his bike in the snow.
Yeah.
He's like covered. It talks about hitting his the heart rate of someone half his age.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh shit. Now I'm thinking about that kind of crap.
Yeah, it's totally true. And I think it's funny. So that's something I shared a lot with Calvin, because my dad is a big cyclist, and he, we see him walk out the door in this like ridiculous get up, like all the spandex and like we used to call my dad Bug Eyes because he wear those goofy glasses that all of us wear now.
Nice.
And like Calvin's reactions to like his dad walking out and like willingly going on a bike ride are hilarious. So
yeah, well, especially when Calvin's bike attacks him like a rabid dog or like a horse or something.
Yeah.
Another thing why I heart Calvin and Hobbes, and this is more with talking about Bill Watterson, but Bill Watterson hasn't licensed Calvin and Hobbes like a ton of other, because I mean, frankly, like he hasn't licensed Calvin and Hobbes like a ton of other comic strip artists have, which now is almost the only way to make money as a comic strip artist.
Right.
So you don't see a ton of Calvin and Hobbes merchandise, like Garfield or Dilbert. There will never be a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon series, despite the newspapers and I think whoever the publisher was for Calvin and Hobbes, it was like Universal Comics or something like that. They wanted Bill Watterson to do that kind of thing and to license, because they would make boatloads of money because Calvin Hobbes for the entire run was so popular. But that's what I've really liked is Bill Watterson has, he's just, I'm a comic strip artist and I'm an artist and that's what I want to do, and has remained pretty reclusive during his entire time, during Calvin and Hobbes, his career with Calvin and Hobbes, and after his career with Calvin and Hobbes.
Right.
Yeah. And I like that. It's not, it makes Calvin and Hobbes this kind of golden image in our minds and doesn't become twisted like with Garfield, how now the only funny thing about Garfield is when other people take Garfield strips and like make Garfield just a regular cat or take him away or make him this horrible demon monster.
There's that fantastic Garfield movie.
Yes, exactly.
With now, I will say Jennifer Love Hewitt in that movie. Fox.
Oh boy, Adam.
Bill Murray as Garfield. Classic.
Fox. Did you ever? Go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, like, on that note too. We'll hop into like more of like Bill Watterson in general, but I looked it up, and you mentioned that for comic strip artists to make money these days, they have to sell out more or less for like license. But they estimate as of I would imagine that Bill Watterson is not doing terribly from a financial standpoint. So like I think he's worth at least in the millions to tens of millions of dollars. So I think it's proof that if you stick to your kind of your values and you produce content that people want to consume regardless as to how it's distributed, I think you can really build on that personally. Yeah. But one thing on the whole like cycling dad thing, one of my favorite strips, because it's really I'm going to read off a comic strip. So listeners, you're welcome.
Yeah. Enjoy it, listeners. Enjoy it.
So it's Calvin's opening up the front door and he goes, "Hey Dad, I'm doing a traffic safety poster. Do you have any ideas for a slogan?" And then Calvin's dad is like in his cycling gear getting ready to go on a ride. And he goes, "Sure, cyclists have a right to the road too, you noisy, polluting, inconsiderate maniacs. I hope gas goes up to $8 a gallon." Then the last panel, Calvin's walking away. "Thanks, Dad. I'll go ask Mom."
Yeah, it's so true.
But that was quintessentially my dad growing up.
Yeah,
it was
nice.
But it's it was just stuff like that where when I was young, I didn't get that nearly as much, and now I do.
Yeah. Going back to talking about Bill Watterson and talking about comic strips, and we can talk about kind of the modern age of comic strips, but you said you're a fan of Pearls Before Swine.
Yeah.
So did you know that Bill Watterson was a guest artist on Pearls Before Swine?
I did. I can't remember exactly when when it was. But
it was like 2013, maybe 2014. But Bill Watterson in Pearls Before Swine, the humor is amazing. The art, and I think the artist himself would say the art is pretty basic. The characters have just like stick arms and stuff like that and stick legs. But in the series that Bill Watterson drew I think he did like a week's worth of comics for Pearls Before Swine. So it's like the artist is talking with this 5-year-old girl, his like next door neighbor, who says she can draw his comic better than he can. And it's Bill Watterson drawing Pearls Before Swine. So it's like these really well-drawn characters with a lot of action and so much going on in the background. And it's just hilarious because it's like, again, Bill Watterson just hopping into a comic strip and immediately pushing the medium. And it kind of goes to show that, because I really like Pearls Before Swine.
Yeah.
And I think Bill Watterson worked with Pearls Before Swine because he considers that comic strip and that artist to be kind of what he himself, Bill Watterson, was trying to do with Calvin and Hobbes was to kind of push the medium forward, and also giving more support to comics that aren't as popular. Because, I mean, newspapers hardly take risks on comic strips. They just want, comics that they know are good. So that's why Peanuts is still running. That's why Garfield is still running. That's why Dilbert is still running. Even like Foxtrot and Zitz, those are old comics now. And really the place where new comic artists have found their medium is online. Because frankly, nobody's buying newspapers anymore, but web comics is kind of the place to find that medium being pushed forward. And I kind of wish Bill Watterson would come back and do a web comic. That'd be amazing. Anyway, so did you have something to say, Adam?
Building off of that point. So I actually pulled up one of the Pearls Before Swine strips, but before I read it off, yet another joke.
Perfect.
Like you were saying before, is how Bill Watterson really pushed the medium. And that's one of the notes that we have. It's just like the artistry behind the construction of the panels and really pushing to not be confined to, 3 or 4 boxes within a row, because it would like ruin the storytelling aspect of what he was trying to get at within his comic. Right. And, same thing with like the Sundays. Like that was one of the things with the 10th anniversary edition where he started to explain more about why his Sunday strips were so fluid. And, the only way he was able to do that was because his comic strip was so popular that he was like, no, this is the way I'm going to do it. And this is the way that and you could see that progression when he first started and started to push, and definitely got pushed back from the newspapers. And he noted that in the 10th anniversary edition. He goes, this would have flowed better if I was able to do this, this, and this. But then in the later strips, he's able to do, just be much more creative with the use of his space. So I think that's one thing.
Yeah, totally.
I think the second thing is you really get adapted to Calvin's personality, and the more you recognize Calvin's personality and where he's joking and where he's sarcastic, the funnier all the rest of the comic strips become. In my opinion. But so there's one of the Pearls Before Swine things, and this goes back to the whole point about kind of Bill Watterson pushing the medium and using more space. And is first panel is Pearls is now drawn by a second grader, which is Bill Watterson, and you've got Pig going, so do you think the kind of stuff we talk about will change now that we have a real artist? And Rat going, no, we'll always be a talking head strip. Then Pig going, so then that sometimes has Martian robot attacks. And it's just like a big panel with, robots attacking the city. And then it goes back to the original, the last panel is, the comic strip. Author says, stop showing off. And then the little second grader goes, I could do better if I had more space.
Right. Yeah.
That's so true of like Bill Waters, like poking fun at himself and like his own presence within the industry. Right.
Yeah. It's like, if you just give me a whole page, I could make this comic so much better for you. Oh yeah. I remember reading about it online. I was like, what? I got to see this. I got it. Bill Watterson has drawn new stuff since Calvin and Hobbes. It's wonderful. In wrapping up, do you have any more final thoughts for Calvin and Hobbes?
Yeah, I'd say I would like to dive a little bit into just what Calvin's imagination, how it kind of inspired the rest. I guess my childhood to a certain extent, but like the themes behind how Calvin got from point A to point B within the story were amazing. So I really liked all the stories around like the transmogrifiers, where you basically just transform into whatever the heck you wanted to. The duplicator, which I thought was hilarious, when he had like 7 or 8 identical Calvin clones running around.
Well, and in thinking about the comics and now as an adult, and even a little bit back then, but there are so many levels to that, especially that duplicator story where Calvin is pretending that he has multiple, like I think it's 7 or 9 clones of himself running around and doing all this stuff. And it's like a whole week's worth of a comic story where his duplicates are going to school. His duplicates are like eating dinner and bringing dinner back up to his room so his other duplicates can eat. So it's just, that's on one level funny because it's absurd. But then on the other level is Calvin, the 6-year-old child, committing to the joke of and committing to the fact that he duplicated himself. So in real life, he is the entire time pretending to be these different duplicates. Like, I remember there's one comic where he's in school and it's like, Miss Wormwood asks Calvin, like, does he have his homework? And it's like, oh, duplicate 6 was here yesterday. You can get it from him next week when he's in school. So it's just like, when you think about it, it's these, on so many different levels, it's just this hilarity that ensues because Calvin is just a 6-year-old. I don't know if a 6-year-old would actually do that, but like having that mental gymnastics of maintaining that joke. I mean, as a older kid, Calvin would be like hilarious, just like maintaining that level of humor. Yeah. Something we all strive to be. And that's why we have, such great jokes on this podcast, Adam.
Exactly. Well, I think that gets into, obviously, both you and I said that Calvin and Hobbes influenced our respective senses of humor. And you can clearly see the influence that Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes has had on the comic strip industry. I mean, there's the Foxtrot where literally, Bill Almond, he has like different, snowmen, and one has like a hole through it, and it's one of those kind of like slightly twisted snowscape scenes with snowmen that Calvin would always create in his front yard. Yeah. And the two characters in Foxtrot go, this way it's an homage, not a ripoff.
Nice.
But stuff like that, the whole Pearls Before Swine inclusion. But then, have you seen kind of the young Calvin and Hobbes?
It's are you talking about where Calvin and Susie Durkins have gotten married and they have a kid?
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about, where it's somebody paid tribute to Bill Watterson and drew a future Calvin and Hobbes comic strip in the future where Calvin is now a dad and he's given his young 6-year-old daughter his Hobbes stuffed tiger, and it's exactly the same. The 6-year-old daughter views Hobbes as an anthropomorphic tiger, right, and goes on some adventures. Yeah, it's those comics, the homage to Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson is really touching. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's this, the legacy of Calvin and Hobbes is continued on beyond just the original strips. Now, what does annoy me a little bit is like all the bootleg Calvin and Hobbes stuff that's out there, especially the one one of the most infamous ones is Calvin and Hobbes that's seemingly peeing on something.
Yeah, I hate
like
that.
It's on the back of all the big jerk pickup trucks. I think it's
Calvin's
cool.
peeing on a Ford, or Calvin's peeing on the Chevy logo.
That's not what's going on now. One, that image never appeared in a Calvin and Hobbes film,
right?
In a Calvin and Hobbes panel. It was actually Calvin filling up a water balloon,
right?
And yeah, it just makes me mad because I think that it completely destroys the essence of who Calvin is. Like, Calvin was never evil, and
right,
or he was never evil, and he was malicious, but only in a joking way,
right?
Especially when it came to like his teacher or Susie Durkins or whatever. And it was all like jokes and good fun. But yeah, like I said, it makes me unhappy whenever I see that. Like, you stop that right now.
Adam throws a cease and desist letter on anybody's truck that has Calvin peeing on the Ford logo or the Chevy logo or the Dodge Ram logo.
Yeah, exactly.
I've always, it was interesting because I remember going to the beach and seeing this like t-shirt shop that had image of Calvin, the one where Calvin takes a bath by sitting in the toilet and then flushing the toilet, and he spins around. So it's like Calvin on the front of the shirt about to flush the toilet, and on the back it's the image of him spinning around. Yeah. And like being like, oh, a Calvin and Hobbes t-shirt when I was younger, and then later being like, hey, that is unlicensed material. You jerk, you can't be using that.
Yeah, and I think to wrap up too, I think the big thing for me about Calvin and Hobbes is that it's incredibly funny, very witty, but as you were saying beforehand, it is and can be very, very sentimental. And ultimately it's just a comic strip about two best friends. that, through everything, they're supportive of one another, they love each other, but they disagree all the time.
Right.
And so it's
totally.
this like very realistic view of friendship, this very realistic view of being a child, of being parents, of being, a teacher. So I really, once again, I respect and really admire the empathy that Bill Watterson has built into every single character and the way he constructs stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Nice.
So in sum, listeners, all you billions of listeners out there, go read Calvin Hobbes. So question for you, Daniel, do you think that people should, is there like a good starting point that you think people should pick Calvin Hobbes up?
Oh gosh. I think starting from the beginning is the place to go. Starting with the very first comic, or even just getting one of the essential Calvin and Hobbes collections.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of places to find Calvin and Hobbes online. The complete collections are amazing. The 10-year anniversary collection is amazing because it gives insight, like Adam was talking about, from Bill Watterson, and some really good forwards from Bill Watterson. Yeah, get the books. The books are the place to go, but starting from the beginning is probably the best.
Yeah, and I actually think it's almost better to start with one of the weekly panels and going forward through like one of the story arcs, because I think that gives you a better sense of Calvin's personality than going with the super flashy, colorful Sunday strips. But that's just me. But and I think that's how my taste has evolved a little bit. Is I love the story arcs. And it reads more like a graphic novel than just a flash in the pan joke.
Totally. Yeah. Nice.
All right.
Well, let's hop into recommendations, Adam.
Recommendations.
Let's see. So last time we had our good friend Jeffrey, who recommended we watch the movie Outbreak and Tiger King. Did you watch either of those?
Nope.
I did not watch Outbreak. I don't know how I feel about watching a movie similar to the situation we're in right now. I'm filled with anxiety and anxious enough already, so I'm not sure if I can handle that right now. But I did watch Tiger King. Katie and I watched Tiger King. It was ridiculous. I don't think there was enough murder mystery in it. I thought it was going to be more focused on the murder mystery.
What's the premise of that?
So it follows, apparently there are a bunch of people in America and people around the world who privately own big cats. And there are privately owned big cat zoos, mostly they're everywhere. They're in every state. I'm not going to pigeonhole them into certain states, but the states that are focused in Tiger King are Oklahoma and Florida and kind of that region. But it kind of gives you a glimpse into the world of privately owned big cats. But it also talks about tiger rescue owner Carol Baskins, who they talk about how did she get her money? Well, she killed her husband, supposedly. Or that's what everybody claims. I don't want to get sued for libel or defamatory statements, although I think Tiger King has done enough of that. So I guess in our lowly podcast, we're probably safe to say that Carol Baskins or Beryl Caskins maybe murdered her husband. But if you're not, honestly, the documentary was really eye-opening and kind of sad to see how these people are privately owning these tigers and big cats, and how there are more big cats in privately owned captivity than there are in the wild. It was a fascinating look. I don't know if the message really, I don't know if the filmmakers were getting the message across until like the very end. Like they were certainly giving you the materials to craft the message yourself. But then at the very end, they give like, they're like 100,000 tigers in captivity, but only 10,000 in the wild. That's a totally random number. I don't know if that's correct. But if you want to stay up on the memes, Adam, I would suggest watching Tiger King. It is fascinating, if sad and heartbreaking. But I would suggest watching it, even just for the hairstyles of the people that you meet in there.
Okay. Well, I'll consider it.
And last time you recommended that I listen to the new Lamb of God single, Memento
Yes.
Mori,
Yes.
which I had already done, which is a great song. Gives me a little bit more hope for the new album.
Yeah.
And you also suggested I listen to the album. What is that? That's the Thrice album that you were listening to. What is it called?
It was
Palms. That's it.
Palms. Yes.
Recording on Palm Sunday. Thrice Palms. Haha. So we talked a little bit about Thrice last episode. So back when their album, The Artist in the Ambulance, came out, I actually listened to that album quite a bit. And I did listen to this Palms album, Adam, and I was surprised at how much keyboard work was on there. I'll be honest, I didn't find it really grabbing me or groundbreaking enough to make me want to listen to it, but I appreciate the recommendation.
No, I mean, I would not classify it as groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination.
In the last episode, you were like, this groundbreaking band Thrice.
I just thought it was curious. Let's put it this way, compared to the sound that Thrice had prior to the last few albums, I just wasn't as much of a fan. So this
Gotcha.
Like their sound has shifted, and I think in a positive way for me at least. So
Gotcha.
yeah, that's why I recommend. And because I had the album the Hisu.
Okay.
It's VHEISSU. Yeah, the Visu.
You got it.
And it was like, oh, it's just like this groundbreaking album, and it's amazing. And I was like, okay, sure, why not? So I bought it and just wasn't super impressed with it. It just didn't grab me.
Gotcha.
But then, like I said, Palms and To Be Everywhere Is to Be Nowhere, basically the last two studio albums, their sound is more akin to what I prefer.
Gotcha.
So I didn't know I thought you may like it more than other Thrice stuff that you've listened to.
Maybe I'll check it. Maybe I'll go back to it at some point, give it another shakedown. But I appreciate the recommendation, Adam.
You're welcome. What do you have to recommend to me this week?
Well, hold on.
Yep.
Last time I recommended to you that you listen to Red Death's Sickness Divine. Did you listen to that?
I did not listen to that.
Adam, you should. It's good. I think you'll like it.
Okay. All right. It's in my favorites. Sorry. I guarantee you I'll listen to it by the next time we record.
I guarantee. Okay. What would you like to recommend this time, Adam?
So have you seen the movie 1917 yet?
I have not. No.
You should watch it. I don't know how, like, do you generally like movies like, Saving Private Ryan, Black Hawk Down, that kind of thing?
Yes. Saving Private Ryan is one of my favorite movies. Surprise.
So like the storytelling aspect of the movie is solid, but I think as a self-proclaimed cinemaphile, you will enjoy the camera work. And
gotcha.
The cinematography in this is stunning. So the whole thing about it is that that it's supposed to be. It's like Sam Mendes, the director. He made the movie look like it was shot in one single continuous take, which is really impressive. And it was just it's just this very linear, very fluid storytelling throughout. And then like yesterday, I watched it yesterday, and literally usually I'm like checking out my phone every now and then, and especially in war movies. But this one really drew me in just because I was fascinated by the cinematography of it. And it's a World War I movie, and World War I was infamous because it was just such a gruesome war. Right. And I don't Mendes definitely hits on that on multiple occasions, but it wasn't like disgusting.
Gotcha.
Like throughout the entire movie. Or like wholly disturbed, but it had this really, really, visceral feel to kind of this helpless feeling that the main characters go through throughout the entire one. So yeah,
Gotcha.
I think you would enjoy it.
It's on my list. I want to watch it. Well, thank you, Adam.
And what would you like to recommend to me this week?
Let me think. I'll give you another album to listen to.
Okay.
Have you ever listened to Melvins or the Melvins?
No.
Okay. So they're a band from... They're not like a new band. They've been around forever. And I've only really just discovered them, which is silly. Not silly, but, you know, their first album came out in 1989. So I was aware of them, or maybe even earlier. They're kind of like a groove metal band, kind of almost. Very riff heavy with fun lyrics and, yeah, just kind of groovy music. But the album I want you to listen to is called Senile Animal, and it's this collection of songs that at the beginning, most of the first 5 or 6 songs are like 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 30 seconds, 3 minutes. But then the later songs are like 6.5 minutes. So it's this very interesting collection of songs that I was kind of surprised at how much I liked. And I've just been finding myself going back to this album. So I would kind of like to talk to you about it and get your opinion on it. Because, again, a little more groove focused. But yeah, please listen to Melvin's Senile Animal.
Do. Gladly.
Yay! Well, thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you, Daniel.
And
to all our readers / listeners, we'll have the full audio transcript in the show notes, so you can read through this this brilliance that is filling your ear holes, so we can fill your eye holes as well.
Yeah, so you can read and listen to the Calvin and Hobbes jokes that Adam explained. And then we'll do the same thing for the Simpsons episode, so you can hear me and read me explaining Simpsons jokes.
But yeah, listeners, if you know, we both highly recommend Calvin and Hobbes, especially since we're all locked up in social isolation or social distancing, and got nothing else better to do. Order some Calvin and Hobbes books and
hell yeah.
And let us know what you think. On that note, our social media handles are as follows. Daniel, you can find us on Instagram at
Passion Fruits Podcast.
Find us on Facebook,
Passion Fruits Podcast.
On Twitter,
Passion Fruits P2 or Passion Fruits Podcast.
And then lastly, drop us ye old electronic mail at
passionfruitspodcast@gmail.com. We are also on a blog because we're super cool. It's passionfruitspodcast.home.blog. We're also on YouTube. We are on every single podcast app that you can find us on. Drop us a line, write us a review, read us a review. Just, just do it. Talk to us. So it doesn't feel like we're talking to the ether and talking to ourselves. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Adam, thank you.
Alrighty.
Is Adam still there?
Welcome, everyone.
For Passion Fruits Podcast, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Adam.
Good morning, everybody.